Welcome back. You are listening to Local Voices on 94.7 KPIP as our discussion with Mr. Jim Steele rolls on. We're talking about the 80th anniversary of the start of World War II, which is September the 1st, 2019. Now, after Hitler, he ran for president once in 1932. He lost.
Right.
Miserably, I understand. And then, in the next election, he didn't get president. Von Hindenburg was still president. But Hitler was the chancellor. And at that time, as I understand it, Hitler was really sowing the seeds for either another coup or the death of von Hindenburg and his eventual calling for another election and being elected as the president when he was really much more like a dictator.
Yeah, he really just became a total dictator within a very short period of time.
And he did something that really defines a democracy. He went against it. There was a new prison. It was called Dachau. Mm-hmm. And he put his political opponents in Dachau prison.
And life became much more difficult for the Jewish people bit by bit. Their businesses were taken away. There was a horrible night, I think it was 1937, what they called Kristallnacht, when the stormtroopers went around and destroyed a lot of Jewish businesses. And many Jews recognized what was happening, and they emigrated to the United States or elsewhere.
So with Hindenburg dead, what happened to the remaining communists and socialists in Germany before World War II?
Well, I think their parties just ceased to exist. Hitler decided we're enemies of the state, ended up either being put to death or in the concentration camps. Yeah, of course, many of the concentration camps came to be used to place the Jews in, and as war went on, they went into the final solution where they were killed in the gas chambers.
But one of the main things, and I've never quite understood this, while he was chancellor, he was building up the SS. What was the SS as opposed to, like, it wasn't the army, but it was the SS. It was a fighting force.
It was kind of an elite force. They were military, but it was an elite force of people that did some of the more unsavory things.
And they were completely loyal to Hitler.
Yes.
So one of the things that really solidified Hitler as a dictator, or as they would come to call him, the Fuhrer, mm-hmm. was that he made the German army do what?
Well, I think pledged loyalty to him, didn't he?
Instead of Germany.
Yeah.
They pledged loyalty to Hitler. So with the army and the SS now pledged to obey him, and not Germany, what happened in Nuremberg?
Well, that's where they would hold the big rallies every year, and of course they became more and more impressive. And everybody has seen film of those things.
With the high-stepping soldiers and doing the Sieg Heil. Something he did, once he got the army under his control, there was one thing that Hitler did that really changed the face of war. Unlike it had been changed in hundreds and hundreds of years, he created a special branch of military service in Germany. His creation was the Air Force.
Oh, under Goering, yeah, Goring.
And that changed it, because like you were talking before, it was trench warfare. They were on the ground, they were in tanks. They probably had some like surface missile, like cannons back in the old days. But they didn't fight World War I in the air at all.
No. There was some aircraft used, but it was pretty limited. No, definitely the Germans, because they've always been technologically superior in terms of science and things like that, and they still are to this day. When you think about all the developments that have come out of Germany, not only Germany, but also England and the United States. But the point being, as you say, the Air Force became a very potent element of the German war machine, and of course the high-speed tanks. Now, tanks had been introduced in World War One, but they were more developed and faster and more effective as a result of some of the work done in Germany. And the same thing with sea power. They had a submarine fleet, huge battleships. They were obviously building up for war. But the problem was that France and England and even the United States, we thought we were safe behind our two oceans. We had other things. They had other things to concern themselves, the Depression and one thing and another. And there was one person who was in England, that of course was Churchill, who tried to warn of what was happening in Germany, but by and large he was ignored. And in the United States, particularly far-seeing people like Roosevelt and some others tried to, we kind of figured we might end up in it. But at least up until the late 30s and early 40s, we kind of hoped we'd stay out of it.
Well, I want to go back to the League of Nations. They passed something called the Treaty of Versailles. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was and why did it fail?
Well, the Treaty of Versailles was actually the treaty agreed to by the warring powers at the end of the war. And Wilson was part of that, and Clemenceau and Daladier, who was from France. And that is the treaty that produced all these horrible reparations.
Gotcha.
And it was the whole idea was that Germany would be punished, but what they didn't take into effect is that was part of the reason that Germany then rearmed. And there were certain stipulations, but Germany got so powerful that by the mid-30s, Hitler just ignored them.
Do you think if we had helped Germany rebuild their democracy after World War I, that there wouldn't have been a World War II?
Well, yeah, had we been in the League of Nations, because like I said, the Senate, after we kind of, this isolationist swing back started right after. In other words, we were going to return to normalcy, to use Harding's phrase. And had we been part of the League of Nations and actually worked with them, why, it is possible that maybe Hitler wouldn't have done what he did.
He'd just be a soldier and...
Well, the thing of it is, the other powers, including, just didn't do anything to stop him. And they realized what was happening. But some people realized what was happening, but they just kind of turned their back on it. And they kept thinking, okay, if we give him a little bit here, he'll stop. And that's eventually what came into effect with the Munich Agreement in 1938.
Before that, though, FDR had been elected, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he had signed an act that would make America even more isolated from the troubles of the outside world. It was the Neutrality Act.
Well, yeah, it wasn't so much a matter that we would be isolated. It was a matter that we wanted to stay out of the war. And, of course, you had other elements in there, too, as you had Russia was part of the factor, and you have Japan. And the Neutrality Act was pushed through to keep us neutral and not taking sides, because everybody hoped that we'd stay out of the war, and that's understandable. But personally, Roosevelt realized that eventually we'd have to be in it, and that became more and more clear even as the late 30s.
Now, let's talk about the Jews for a moment. Now, contrary to popular belief, he was not the one that started persecuting the Jews to begin with. They had been persecuted quite a lot against in the early 20s in many European countries. Is that true?
I think so. And they have, part of their heritage is sort of not having their own homeland. That's ultimately what led to the establishment of Israel, which of course was a very good thing. But yes, they were persecuted in Russia, other places, and they were seen as money changers, and they really weren't to blame for what happened, but the propaganda machine that Goebbels had and things like that convinced many people that they were the enemy.
Jews, they had basically all their rights taken away.
Eventually, yeah. And bit by bit, yeah, they did. And
even before World War II, I mean, They weren't considered citizens anymore. They couldn't vote. They couldn't do anything. Was that part of the Nuremberg laws?
Well, I think it was part of the decisions made at Nuremberg and decisions made by Hitler. It didn't all happen at once. I mean, and eventually, of course, they had to walk around with Star of David on there, and so yeah, there was ultimately they were limited in everything they did, and eventually, of course, they started to put them in the concentration camps.
So around this time, when Hitler was having his huge Nuremberg rallies, which we won't comment on, around that same time, Spain now was in all-out civil war.
Correct.
And two of main people that would become giants in what we know now as the Axis powers.
Correct.
Were Hitler and Mussolini. Because Mussolini was fighting and helping in the Spanish Civil War, and then Hitler got into it. And that's really where those two dictators formed their relationship, wasn't it?
I think so. And actually, the idea that the strong nationalist imperial concepts that Mussolini developed earlier, before Hitler, he served as sort of a tutor initially to Hitler. Eventually, it was the other way around. And the fighting that was going on in Spain from about 1936 to 1939 served as sort of a practice field for learning for some of these new elements of war, tank warfare, airplanes, things like that. And so it was sort of, yes, it was eventually Spain never entered the war one way or the other, but it did serve as kind of a proving ground or prelude to World War II.
And together, they helped create the Axis Pact. We just didn't come up with these names because, we'll get the Allies, we'll call them the Axis because it sounds scary. No, they actually came up with an Axis Pact. What was this pact, and who was a part of it?
Well, Spain never was part of the Axis Pact, although I think they were seen as sympathetic to Germany. The Axis Pact initially was Italy and Germany, and then in 1940, Japan was part of it. The amount of cooperation, particularly involving Japan, I think was relatively minimal. But that was the Axis, and of course we were the Allies.
Who were the Allies?
Well, there were many allies, including a lot of countries in South America and so forth. But primarily, it was the United States and Britain and Canada. Mexico was an ally, and
China.
And China, yeah, that's correct.
And Russia, to skip way ahead, Russia ended up being kind of neutral. They had an agreement with Germany during World War II, right? And they said, look, if you don't come on our land, you don't mess with us, we won't help you, but we won't hurt you.
Yeah, there was a pact signed in 1939. They were kind of staying out of things. And then when Hitler did a lot of things where he didn't keep his word on stuff. And so when he invaded Poland, and that impacted the Soviet Union, why then, of course, they declared war on Germany, and I think that didn't happen until about 1941. So yes, they initially were kind of on Hitler's side, and then of course they became part of the Allies. And I think what we have to realize is eventually, as the war dragged on, irrespective of what we think of Russia today, their casualties were far worse than anybody else's. I mean, they really were the ones that ultimately defeated Hitler, in addition to, of course, the Allied landing on D-Day in 1944, and he got crunched from both sides. But when you think about Germany at its prime in terms of territories they had taken over, it included all of France. Vichy was sort of partly under their control, but it wasn't occupied by Germany. That was the southern part of France, and they had taken over parts of northern Africa, obviously all the way into Russia. And Poland, so forth and so on. So that they by say 1942, they controlled a huge amount of territory, and for all practical purposes, all of Europe.
You're listening to Local Voices on 94.7 KPIP. We will be right back to continue our discussion with Jim Steele on the 80th anniversary of the start of World War II. Hang on.